Today we are complaining. That's right. The weekend is about to begin, so what better thing to do than angrily shouting at the clouds? What are we shouting at for today is a continuation of what we read through yesterday, a series of comments from the WoW devs which led some more, disappointments in the player base. But there is one particular thing as I was going through the interview that triggered me to such an extent we actually have to make an entire new video about it. And that's the part about defensives. The part we touched on yesterday was Ion Azikostas, the lead game designer of WoW, touching on the situation of the defensive creep and more specs having defensives and way to survive by themselves and making, healers less and less powerful, etc. And what I pointed out as ironic was Ion saying, yeah, I think objectively Dragonflight and the talent system added the ability to opt into more hybrid utility and more defensive and self-healing tools for DPS specs that may be part of hybrid classes. What I found funny is that this sounded like, oh yeah, that's the reason why Balanced Druid is tankier, because they are stealing talents that were meant for Guardian, or something like Warriors get tankier because they take talents meant for protection, or, Ret and Holy take talents for prot, right? Well, the funny thing is that the tankiest specs in the game right now, like for example Mage specs or Rogue specs or Warlock specs, are all pure DPS classes. So no, there is no hybrid talenting that makes them tankier, unlike what this interview was pointing at. But what is even more sad and what sparked this video is the next follow-up, which is it's important that all players have some outs to situations. Tools that they can use, but they shouldn't have so many that we are assuming that one is always up, and they shouldn't be so potent or so frequently available that they are overshadowing the contribution of a healer to keeping you alive in a group setting, right? This is where we have Fire Mage coming into the picture. This was perhaps sparked by yet another set of balance tuning which had mysteriously Shaman missing. Because when you actually do indeed compare the defensive power of the two classes, and more in particular of this spec Fire with Shaman, it is actually quite grotesque. That's the word I would use for the difference between the two. Because at face value, it's not even that bad. At face value, Mage has a mirror image, whereas Shaman has a 2-minute cooldown that can be reduced down to 90 seconds, which gives you a flat-out 40% damage reduction. So it's like, well, I don't know much about this, but it looks like Astral Shift of Shaman is stronger, which you would be correct in assessing. There is a problem though. Fire Mage also has a personal Absorb Shield. They also have an AoE Absorb Shield. They also have a nice block immunity, which can be transformed into a 70% DR, which is practically the strongest DR in the game, barring Dispersion of Shadow Priest, and it can be reduced from 4 minutes to 3, and to finish this all off, they also have Alter Time, which can again be a super strong defensive as long as you don't get one shot. However, never mind, you can also get one shot because Fire Mage also has access to Cauterize, which is a cheat death. Now, when you take all of this and you go back to Shaman, this becomes one of those moments where you think you are sane, you think you look at things objectively, and then you look at the comparison between the two, and really it gets hard not to imagine there must be a different treatment being given to these two classes. Even something as iconic as Reincarnation, right? Reincarnation, Ankh for the friends, is essentially a self-combat res for the Shaman, right? And the cooldown is 30 minutes. Even if we include this talent, it can be maybe a 25-minute cooldown, 20-minute cooldown, maybe at the very best. Now go back comparing this to Cauterize. This is a proper cheat death, which has a 5-minute cooldown and resets after a boss has been pulled. So it's always available on pull on a raid boss. And it prevents you from dying. This one has a 30-minute cooldown, doesn't reset after every boss pull, and actually gets you killed. So you lose every buff you had active on you that was temporary, including food buff, including bloodlust, including any of the procs you might have had, etc., And don't forget, if you're a healer, you also lose a gigantic amount of mana, for example. Not to mention the possible logistical problems of dying, for example, in the middle of a pool of bed on the ground. How can I ank at 20% HP if I'm gonna immediately die as soon as I rest? Whereas Cauterize keeps me alive, even better, it gives me movement speed to quickly reposition to a safe spot, doesn't make me lose my buffs, and has a 5-minute cooldown and happily resets after every pull of a boss, for example, in a raid. That alone is a crazy difference. Crazy. We could have a balance tuning in the beta right now which reads Ank's cooldown has been reduced by 500% and it would still be weaker than Cauterize. It would still be a weaker cheat death because it's not even an actual cheat death, it's a scuffed version of a cheat death. The same goes for the other defensives as mentioned. Outside of the defensive of Shaman, the default one, you have 15% max HP when you pull out your Earth Elemental, 10% max HP given by default, as well as this 20% max HP heal when you drop below 35% health. These three minor things, the max HP and the small heal, pale in comparison. They pale in comparison to Barrier, plus Second Barrier, plus Alter Time, plus Cheat Death, plus Immunity, or possibly a very strong DR. It really becomes difficult to try to not be biased and give up completely and be an absolute doomer when you see the difference in here. Especially when you just read what the lead game designer just said. We want to give all players some outs to situations, but also not so many outs that we are assuming one is always up. Well, when you look at Mage, you have this one every 20 or so seconds, you have this one every 50 seconds, you have this one every 3 minutes, you have Mirror Image every minute and a half, you have Cheat Death always up to save your ass, and you have Mass Barrier every couple of minutes. What does Shaman have? They have this one every 90 seconds, and then what? 15% max HP every 5 minutes? What else? Even the movement part of the talents are tragic. I know movement isn't exactly a defensive itself, but look at the state of Shaman requiring 5 different talents just put into movement. 10% movement speed to Ghost Wolf, which is not something that lets you do damage. You have the movement ability on a 30-second cooldown, which is a longer cooldown than a double charge of Blink, plus blinks you a shorter distance than Blink, plus is not instant like Blink but has travel time, plus this Blink lets you cast while moving unlike Gust of Wind of Shaman, plus this Blink also gives you 20% movement speed after you blink. Meanwhile, Shaman has to spend 5 talent points just to turn Gust of Wind into a 20-second cooldown and just to give you 10% movement speed on your Ghost Wolf. How can you take these talents compared to this and this and this and this impartially, as if they were weighed the same way? And let's not just, beat a currently dead horse too much and just bang on Shaman for too much. We know it's in a terrible state, but it's not that other specs or classes are doing too well. Druid has progressively gotten squishier and squishier over time. It's gotten to the point where Balanced Druid, for example, was banned from the last couple of bosses in Emergency due to how squishy it was, for example. And it's not that it's in much better of a situation, right? They have Barkskin, which is a decent baseline defensive, much like Astral Shift is. It's even being buffed in the beta. It's a 20% DR, which now with a new talent, Oakskin, you can make it a 30% DR. But that's just about where your conventional defensives end for a druid, because you have no other buttons to press. Your passive self-regen, thanks to Well-Honed Instincts, has been nerfed so much, it's now up to a 2-minute cooldown compared to its glory days of the Shadowlands Conduit. Your only other pseudo damage reduction comes from 4% DR of Thick Hide, and then for everything else you need to go into the cuck shed of turning yourself into a bear to gain 35% max HP if you talent into Ursa and Vigor, and just tank the damage to the face in bear form while you do 0 damage yourself. That's your only other out as a druid. Again, compare it to something like Mage, again, and it's really difficult to justify this difference. It's really difficult to see how can this be equal to the state of Mage right now. Even specs that were previously considered the tankiest ones, like Rogue, for example, because Rogue does have a cheat death. There's a problem though. Mage, like Fire, gets its Cheat Death as a passive ability. You don't even have to spend a talent. For Rogue, this isn't even a passive, this is in a dual choice node with another defensive, which is the very good single target defensive of Feint. Now you have to choose if you want that or if you want Cheat Death. On top of that, for absolutely no reason, despite this one not even being a passive but you having to spend a talent point, the Cheat Death of Rogue has a 6-minute cooldown while the Cheat Death of Mage has a 5-minute cooldown. Why? Why does a passive ability that doesn't even cost a talent point have a shorter cooldown than a talent you also have to take to lose a single target defensive of Elusiveness? That is why it is so triggering. Yeah, sure, if you go into Arcane or even into Frost, they don't get the freebie Cauterize like Fire Mage does, but you're still excessively tanky as a Frost or Arcane Mage anyways. Fire Mage is just the absolute outlier in terms of tankiness. And what makes this worse is that clearly, given by the hero talents, which were developed recently, Blizzard is not getting the message, because for example, Sun Fury gives you 5% more AoE damage reduction when you use your barrier for a mage, but for a shaman, for example, for Stormbringer, it gives you an instacast Chain Heal or Healing Surge after you use Tempest. So it gives you a heal as the only defensive bit in your entire Stormbringer tree. To make this even more hilarious, by the way, this is almost completely useless for an enhancement shaman since they already have their own way with Maelstrom to get themselves an instacast Healing Surge if they wanted. So even with something developed recently, their decision is, let's give more AoE DR to a mage and give a heal to a shaman. You know, how can you not have 2 or 3 or 4 layers of a tinfoil hat on your head by this point? How is this explainable logically, even after what this very recent, of just a couple of days ago, interview was released by the game devs? What's the angle here? What's the point on making certain specs this level of squishiness and then have others to be so far ahead and then say these things unironically? Yeah, we want to give players outs to different situations while making sure they don't have something up to use at all times. And then you just look at the differences and you're like, how is this in any way similar to what they are saying over here? But the final Doompill that we're closing with, the final depressing point, is that this could be okay, and this could make sense if these were the newly added talents for the War Within. These were released a couple of weeks ago. We just had to look at them and we were like, well, you know what? Because the devs have to try to balance each and every different spec on the same level of tankiness, so to speak, maybe the Shaman dev, I know, we are being optimistic, assuming there even is one, maybe the Shaman dev was shooting a little bit under the radar. It was under budgeting the defensive power of Shaman, while the Fire dev, the Mage dev, was a bit over the top. So, you know, it's in the beta, these talents are new, they are going to be quickly adjusted by the time the game comes out. The problem is that this is not a new set of talents. You know, Ice Block has existed for 20 years. Even some newer talents like Mirror Image or like Alter Time that were introduced in BFA or in Shadowlands. So we are still talking about things that is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 years old. Things like the Ankh of Shaman, the Astral Shift of Shaman. These are not very brand new things, which means these things have been okay, according to the devs, by now for several years. These are not brand new talents pushed into the beta that might be changed any day now. These are things that have existed for several years. The fact that a balanced druid can only press Barkskin for themselves has been a thing for ages by this point, right? Or the shaman can only press Astral Shift has gone on for several expansions. And the fact that Mage had all of these different options also has gone on for multiple expansions. That is the more head-scratching point of the current situation when it comes to defensives. The current situation of the spec themselves, we could have mentioned a few others, like the squishiness of the Evoker specs minus augmentation. We could have also went a bit more in detail on Shadow Priest, who is perhaps the more balanced in terms of powerful defensive options without being too OP, but in general the vast gaps between certain specs and others and their power level, and also what Blizzard has just very recently said about the power of the defensives, given how wildly different some of the specs right now are in-game. So even though we don't usually do this, I think we have now reached the boiling point of massive difference in power. So since I am a man of the people, I cannot look away from the plight of some of my brethren, in this case most of the complaints really coming from the shaman angle nowadays. But this has been going on for a while now. It's not just a shaman thing, you know. The healing priests complaining about being too squishy, hunters for a whole lot were far too squishy, the evoker specs are still kinda squishy, warrior specs also are not having too good of a time in terms of defensiveness compared to other specs that are far above the line of what's acceptable. And by the way, don't think you're getting out of this for free, friends. Just because I haven't mentioned you doesn't mean you aren't just as bad as Mage, okay? Don't think yourself any better, by the way. So that was the point for today. The point was complaining about the state of defensives, or rather the imbalance in the power of defensives going from class to class or from spec to spec, in hopes that things get better by the time the new expansion comes out. There is still a couple of months, there is like 3 months before the actual season begins, so I hope we get to have some more parity amongst the specs by the time the expansion comes out. But for today, on this Friday, after we are done with this complaint manifesto, it's time to leave each other. We are starting the goodbyes as usual by thanking all of the supporters, including everyone who is supporting for free by liking and commenting down below on this video, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, yesterday was 29 degrees, today it's 31 degrees. My favorite time of the year, raiding in heat.